it dates back to talks with my father when he was alive. He used to talk about a school chum at Linlithgow Academy who played golf and cricket, but he only had one arm. And that school chum is the subject of this presentation today. That school chum was Doon Campbell, and Doon Campbell went on to work with Reuters for 30 years. This is his story, and if you're wondering where the Magic Mistress title comes from, and I'm sure you've all been wondering that over the weeks while we've been waiting for this talk to come up. Doon used to say that news stories sometimes appeared as if by magic, and they were always magic when they resolved. Reuters in Fleet Street used to have beds because the Reuters correspondents who were based at Fleet Street often ended up sleeping in the office trying to finalise the story. And they used to say that they ended up sleeping with their mistress. So hence the title of the talk, Magic Mistress. Okay, Doon Campbell was actually christened Archibald Doon Campbell. The Doon comes from the Loch Doon in Dumfriesshire. His father was a minister in Annan in Dumfriesshire, and he was a keen fisherman. And he used to fish on Loch Doon, so he probably thought it was appropriate to give his newborn son the middle name of Doon. Doon was born with an incomplete left arm. Nothing else wrong with him at the birth, but for some reason the process didn't finalise his left arm. So he was born with a stump of a left arm. His mother died of cholecystitis, which is a rare infection of the gallbladder, and that was when Doon was 2 years old. Doon's father was a Free Church of Scotland minister, and he was called to be the minister at Craigmelin United Free Church in Linlithgow. I'm not sure if people will remember Craigmelin Church. I tend to remember it myself because it was used as a spillover accommodation while the primary school at the West Port was being repaired at one time. And we're all decanted out of the primary school to various places in the town, one of them being Craigmelin Church, also the Scout Hall on Dogwell Wynd. So just a little bit of church history. There were three churches in Linlithgow at one time. The main one was at the West Port, which became the Linlithgow Primary School. It always had a school as the back room in the church itself. So when the church moved to St Ninians, when St Ninians was completed in construction, the whole of the church was converted into a school. The other two free churches were called the East and the West, and the West Church was what became Craigmelin Church. The East one was at the top of Station Road, which is now a modern bungalow. Well, it's not so modern nowadays, but it was built on the site of the church. Craigmelin Church dates back to Covenanting times, when the Covenanters meetings used to be held at Craigmelin Farm in the Badgate Hills. And Craigmelin Farm was considered appropriate at that time because you could look north from Craigmelin Farm down to the House of the Binns. So the people having their conventicle could see the older Tam Dael marshalling his Scots Greys at the Binns, and disperse their meeting at Craigmalin Farm before the troops could come out to arrest him or whatever. So Craigmalin Church at the top of Dogwell Wynd it's not a particularly inspiring building, but it was, and only the gateposts of that remain. They remain as the entrance to the spires houses that are there. The reason that I include it is that, and this develops into a piece of family history, the Craigmalin Church was I suppose the church of the hillbillies at that time, people who were typically based out of town or at the farms. My father's family lived out at King's Cable at that time, and they had a family pew in the Craigmalin Church, which actually had a balcony looking down onto the pulpit. And my father used to tell me a story that he came from a large family. It was a family of 6 sisters, then followed by 6 brothers. So the family were marched in from King's Cable, the family home, into Craigmalin Church. And they had a family pew there, probably because there were so many of them. And my father told me this story that the beadle used to come in the morning with the Bible, with the place marked for the reading for the day. And he would solemnly open the Bible and read the first lines of it, which were always, "And the Lord said unto Moses, all the Bennies would have big noses." So that always produced a bit of humour in the church. Doon attended Linlithgow Primary School and then on to Linlithgow Academy. Despite only having one complete arm, he was a keen golfer and a cricketer. Doon used to say that he hadn't noticed he only had one arm until primary school, when schoolmates pointed it out to him, and he was called Broken Arm Campbell at primary school. So where my father's association with Doon came about was at the academy. And at the academy in the 1930s, if you were considered suitable for sitting certificate exams, those had to be done at Bo'ness Academy. Bo'ness Academy is still within West Lothian at that point in time. Doon was considered suitable by his father, but he didn't consider it appropriate to send them to Bo'ness Academy, because it was quicker for Doon to take the train into Edinburgh than the steam train, of course, at that time, than the Charabang to Bo'ness. So he was sent to George Watson's in Edinburgh to do his certificate exams. But he was not particularly academic and didn't get good results at hires. And he ended up with only 2 hires in English and history and lowers in Latin and French. And his headmaster's report from George Watson's was not exactly setting the heather on fire. Realising then that he would have to seek employment rather than continuing his education, he decided that he might fancy a career in journalism. And he applied to a number of the Edinburgh newspapers, and he attended a number of interviews, but his half-empty sleeve was noticed in interview, and the interview usually ended with a "we'll let you know," and they never did. So he looked around the local area, and the logical place for journalism at that time was to apply to the Journal and Gazette, or it was the Linlithgowshire Gazette at that time. it was, I suppose, in the days when the Gazette actually did run local stories, so it was probably appropriate for a local lad to join the paper. He wrote the articles for the Gazette, and he also wrote the golf column under the pen name of Albatross. And he was a member at the Linlithgow Golf Club, and he was the honorary secretary for a long period of time. He moved from the Gazette to the Courier, the West Lothian Courier, based in the Broxbourne office. And it was from the Broxbourne office that he wrote his first paid article sold to a number of newspapers. And that was an article reporting on the German raid on the first German raid on the Forth Rail Bridge, which he sold successfully, and started off his career in being able to write a marketable story, I suppose, as a news story. From the Courier, he moved to the Edinburgh Evening Dispatch, which had been the home of a journalist who had moved down to Reuters, a journalist called Tony Cole. The staff in the dispatch office encouraged Doon to perhaps apply to Reuters in London, that it might be appropriate for his own career progression. So Doon sent off an application to Reuters in London, saying that he's prepared to tackle any job or go anywhere, and that because of his partly missing left arm, he was exempt from military service, and therefore he could be guaranteed in that position without having to be backfilled for military service, which was quite common at that time, obviously. That for Doon began a long relationship with Tony Cole, who was the editor at that time at Reuters in London. And Tony Cole was the gentleman who had worked at the Edinburgh Evening Dispatch. Doon started a brief induction when he started at Reuters. And one of the first questions he was asked was, "What do you know about science?" And his response was, "Well, I failed at Hires." So predictably, he was appointed as Reuters science correspondent. And his first article there was to report on the first use of penicillin, which was used by the military in the invasion of Sicily in the Second World War. There's a story there that kind of matches the present day experience. Penicillin, although developed in UK, there was never any means of volume manufacture in the UK. So as a volume drug, penicillin was made in United States of America for use in the Second World War. And it seems that nowadays in the UK we still don't have volume manufacturing capability for potential vaccine for COVID-19. While Doon was working with Reuters, in September 1943, 3 British war correspondents were killed at Salerno, where the US military were just invading as part of the move up through Italy to form the second front in the Second World War. One of those war correspondents was the Reuters correspondent. So Doon was sent as his replacement at the age of 23. He was sent as war correspondent to Italy. His salary was increased to £500 a year, and he was given a 30 shillings a day living allowance and a £75 kit allowance for war correspondence uniform, which was provided by Mistress in London. Doon, living in digs in London at that time, jotted off a letter to his parents saying that if anything happens to me, please burn the box of letters that is marked private. And those were his love letters from his fiancée, Pat, at that time. So arriving in Italy as Reuters war correspondent, Doon was assigned to the 8th Army, reporting from Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino was considered the most perfect natural defence position in Europe. The Allies had initially tried to avoid damage to the monastery, the building on the left-hand side there, at the start of the Second World War. But the bombardment was considered necessary to take the position, and it ended up as a severe artillery bombardment and ultimately aerial bombardment as well. The building itself was ultimately destroyed by the shelling, and it's worth noting that it was actually rebuilt by Italy as their project after the Second World War was over. It was a fairly intensive campaign and resulted in 105,000 Allied casualties and 80,000 German casualties. Doon, as part of his training, always had the eye for a story, and that would continue throughout his career with Reuters. He'd spoken to a US Army Air Force officer as part of his time at Cassino, and he had offered to overfly Cassino with Doon. Doon hadn't taken that offer up, but when Monte Cassino was finally taken by the Polish divisions, he decided he would ask the officer again if he would take him over the Cassino site. And by that time, the Vesuvius volcano was also erupting. So Doon overflew the site of Monte Cassino and also Vesuvius itself, and sent a report back to Reuters saying that he overflew the man-made volcano of Monte Cassino and the natural volcano of Vesuvius at the same time. So that became a fairly high-profile story, and a good sale for Reuters at that time as well. This is a little question just to keep your brains exercised this morning. And I wonder if anybody realizes who this young officer was who was directing some of the artillery operations at Monte Cassino. I'm not sure if anybody knows, but if you're all awake, you can think who that person is. And it was actually Bill McLaren. Bill was an officer involved in spotting operations for the artillery at that time at Monte Cassino. Shortly after, or just around about the same time as Monte Cassino fell, Bill caught TB and was returned to the UK for hospital treatment. That hospital treatment was at Bangor Hospital. And Bill always said that having TB prevented him from actually being a Scotland player at that time. So with the end of the Monte Cassino campaign, Doon was called back to the London office with a message: will you please report to me at the designated time, as I have an assignment for you. It was to report in uniform, full field equipment, properly labelled. And his assignment from Reuters was to be embedded, I'm not sure that is a term that was used at that time in the Second World War, but he was put forward for selection to take part in the D-Day landings. Doon was selected by Lord Lovat himself to go ashore with the number 45 Marine Commando on D-Day. That was Lord Lovat's Scouts. Doon was never sure why he was selected by Lord Lovat. Was it because he was Scottish, or was it because of his casino reporting, which had been quite well received by newspapers picking up his Doon's Reuters releases? When he was told of the departure time, he turned up at the departure point with a suitcase and his portable typewriter. He asked Lord Lovat would he be able to take the items in his suitcase, and Lord Lovat said, well, yes, of course, if they will fit in the commando backpack. He said, well, what about my typewriter? Would I be able to take that? And the answer was yes, if it would fit in the commando backpack. So the Lovat Scouts were piped ashore at D-Day by Lord Lovat's personal piper. Bill Millen was his name. And Doon ended up as the first correspondent ashore at D-Day. And I always found it hard to imagine how a man with a commando backpack containing all of his personal possessions and a typewriter managed to wade ashore at D-Day. I'm sure he wasn't in the first wave ashore, but he was not long after that. And Lord Lovat himself was wounded on day 3 of the D-Day landings. When Doon actually made it ashore, he tried to type his Reuters dispatch. He was under mortar fire at that time, and every time he tried to type, he found that his typewriter keys were clogged up with mud. He had fortunately had an old school exercise book in his commando backpack and wrote his Reuters dispatch on the piece of paper torn from his exercise book, which carried the date line, which I think became famous within Reuters, from a ditch 200 yards inside Normandy. He passed the page of the exercise book to a naval officer who was operating a shuttle between Normandy and the coast of England, and asked him to give it to Reuters when he got back to England, and he gave him a $5 to help him on the way. Throughout after the D-Day landings, Doon remained embedded during the race across Europe. He remained embedded with the commandos and reported back that he had the number of billets that he had at that time. It was just wherever there was a safe place to to bed down for the night, whether it was a chateau boudoir or a cellar or the base of an apple tree or a hole in the wall. And Doon reported at that time, when the bombs stop falling, the shells start screaming and snipers take over from the mortars. Doon followed the commandos all the way through Europe, and eventually crossed the Rhine with the US Army. He was given an offer to take a place in a US Army glider to get him across the Rhine. That wasn't the best result for him. The US glider pilot used a fence to stop the glider when it landed, but he was awarded the US Army glider wings and the combat star. As part of I suppose there was two races across Europe at that time. The race to keep up with the advance, and the Reuters race, which always was to have these news releases released as quickly as possible. At one point, Doon's Jeep driver was racing at Doon's behest to go as quickly as possible, so as Doon could catch a cable timetable back to with his dispatch back to the UK. And the Jeep driver actually crashed the Jeep, smashed through a bridge parapet across a river. The Jeep plunged into the river and Doon broke his left arm. He sent his news release back to Reuters to say that he had broken his left arm, but fortunately it was his left one, so the one that didn't affect his typing. As part of the journey across Europe towards the end of the Second World War, Doon ended up as being one of the first into the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And I think his skill with words and brevity and ability to sum up the situation was, I think, highlighted at that time. And he wrote the dateline for when he went into the camp at Belsen, to say that when he went into the hut, there were 50 men huddled, sore to sore, was his dateline for the release at that time. He ended up with Montgomery back in Hamburg for the final surrender of the German divisions after the death of Hitler. And Montgomery's 8th Army at that time took the surrender of a Panzer regiment, one of the same ones that they'd actually fought at El Alamein. So I think that was a sweet day all round for the 8th Army. Doon then went home at the end of the war, and he was given 2 weeks leave at that time. I don't even think he completed the 2 weeks leave because he got a message from Tony Cole at Reuters in London saying, "Come east, old boy, here's where the action is." I think in practice it was because there was a bit of pressure on staff in the East operations for Reuters at that time, and he really just wanted an additional staff member to go out there to report on that. So Doon ended up with postings in Palestine, in Persia, China, and in India. A fairly miscellaneous trip for him out there. He had several scoops while he was in that time in the Far East. One of the main ones was he received the first interview with Mao Zedong, and coined the phrase "bamboo curtain," which went down in history. The reason that he got the interview with Mao was he used the simple expedient of supplying a list of straightforward questions that he wanted the response to, and it caused great distress to the US press agencies that were working at that time and anxious to speak to Mao, that this young British correspondent had got the interview and they hadn't. So they were fairly ballistic at that time that he got the response. He also made the first release of the notification of the assassination of Gandhi, and was sharp enough to point out that the assassin was a Hindu and not a Sikh or a Muslim, which would have, if it had been anything other than a Hindu, it would have caused severe distress, I think, at the time of the partition of India. So his release went with the priority notification that if his release was used, they had to mention that he was killed by a Hindu and not a Muslim or a Sikh. He ended up reporting on the end of the British protectorate in Jordan, and interviewed King Abdullah, who was King Hussein's father. He almost made a huge mistake, because during the interview with King Abdullah, he crossed his leg to balance his notebook on his knee. And in doing that, he showed the sole of his foot to King Abdullah, which was a huge mistake to make in terms of protocol. Fortunately, King Abdullah noticed that his artificial, Doon's artificial arm, and he recognised his need to balance his notebook on his knee. So he did forgive him for his mistake in showing his sole of his foot, and kindly made him a member of the Arab Legion. Doon then returned to the UK for his first leave in 5 years, and married in June 1949. And he was then promoted to news editor in the Reuters Paris office. That was a brief journey, and he was then called back to 83 Fleet Street, the Reuters office there. So this statue of Paul Julius Reuter is something I used to pass on my way to work when I was working in London, walking down Fleet Street on the way to Plumtree Court to Cooper's and Lybrand's office in that place. Doon held a number of positions while he was back in Fleet Street, initially as news manager, then an editor, and then in charge of European operations after the death of Tony Cole. Her Majesty the Queen has apparently been a frequent visitor to the Reuters office, and she once asked Doon, "How do you edit Reuters?" And Doon replied with an example, and it was an example that had actually happened to him while he was editor. He had a new young reporter in the Reuters office in East Berlin. The young reporter had just completed his national service, and the reporter was returning home one night in East Berlin to find the road blocked by tanks and troops. And he jotted off a frantic cable to Reuters head office in London. The Russians are preparing to invade West Berlin. And Doon, as editor, picked up on that and called the young reporter and said, do you have a desk diary? And the answer was yes. What date is it in your desk diary? 30th of April. And he said, well, it might be worth checking if this may be the rehearsal for the May Day parade of the Russians in East Berlin. And Doon's point to Her Majesty the Queen was, yes, speed is important in getting the news out as quickly as possible, but the editor also has to check for the accuracy of reports, and that is the main purpose at the end of the day. So, who was that young Reuters reporter who made the frantic cable from East Berlin? And you can have a think about that. And it was actually Frederick Forsyth who ultimately applied his imagination to novel writing, I suppose, yeah. So Doon retired from Reuters in 1973 at the end of his 30 years of service. And was awarded the OBE in 1984 for services to journalism, and sadly died in May 2003. So that concludes my presentation. It's important, I think, that to bring to attention that he's a relatively unknown local hero. And it's important that we have these memories of people before they fade completely.